In this video, I present what I find to be the top 5 most important things for you to know about the so-called synoptic problem. If you have a gospel parallels book handy, grab it. And if you have a set of colored pencils handy, also grab those because we're going to do some coloring here. Let's go ahead and jump right in. Number 5. The Synoptic Gospels are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They're called Synoptic Gospels because they can be seen together. If the Synoptic Gospels are Matthew, Mark, and Luke, then the Synoptic Problem, or the Synoptic Puzzle, is comparing these three Gospels in order to determine their literary relationship to one another. The question of who copied from whom. The word synoptic has two parts to it: syn, meaning together, and optic, meaning seen. So synoptic means seen together. What this means is that these three gospels have significant overlap with one another. This is true with respect to their events, their teaching, and their content. It also means that the three gospels can be set side by side by side, and this was first done by Johann Jacob Griesbach in 1776. It's been done many times since then, and there are various gospel parallels that are available today in different languages, including Koine Greek of the New Testament and in English, like Burton Throckmorton's, which is the one that I tend to use and looks like this. You can see here that the Gospels are put into three columns. Mark is what's called the center term or the base term, the one to which the other two are primarily compared. Matthew is to the left and Luke is to the right. These places where there is an episode in all three synoptic gospels, where we have a center term, a left term, and a right term, is called the triple tradition. When I say episode, I don't mean individual words, but the whole account or passage. For example, the whole account of Jesus stilling a storm is included in all three synoptics. It's part of the triple tradition. The account of Jesus cursing a fig tree is only in Matthew and Luke. It's part of what we call the Matthew-Mark overlap. Excuse me, I said it's only in Matthew and Luke. It's only in Matthew and Mark, so it's part of the Matthew-Mark overlap. The account of Jesus healing a man with the withered hand in a synagogue on the Sabbath is included in both Mark and Luke, but it doesn't appear in Matthew. So this is part of what we call the Mark-Luke overlap. And as you can see here, 90% of Mark reappears in Matthew. Matthew copies a lot of material from Mark. So there is therefore more Matthew-Mark overlap episodes than there are Mark-Luke overlap episodes. In all of these cases, the triple tradition, the Matthew-Mark overlap, and the Luke-Mark overlap, Mark is that center term. There is an episode in Mark. But there are many passages that Matthew and Luke share in common with one another, but there's not the center term of Mark. That is, Matthew and Luke share material that's absent from Mark. It looks like this in a gospel parallels book. This is what we call the double tradition, and it makes up a significant portion of Matthew and of Luke, respectively. But where does it come from? We'll get back to that question when we get to number 2 on our list. Number 4 on our list is that polyvocality is not a bad thing. Polyvocality is a two-part word. Poly meaning many and vocality meaning voices. But the voices here need not be literal. Polyvocality is a concept referring to multiple perspectives, narratives, and/or stories on a given topic, person, or place. Polyvocality works under the principle that there is a danger to a single story, that one single overriding perspective can be both dangerous and harmful. This does not necessarily mean that there aren't preferred or right or correct perspectives. It's simply to say that more voices are better than one voice. Diversity is a good thing. Single stories are dangerous because they create overriding perspectives and incomplete stereotypes. Polyvocality, in contrast, allow voices to be put into conversation or dialogue with one another. When it comes to Jesus, this means that there are multiple different perspectives on Jesus. There are multiple Jesuses. When we have multiple portraits of a person, and we've presented this idea before, any person, such as Jesus, it allows us to see the totality of that inexhaustible person. Different characteristics of the person are highlighted in each version or portrait, and comparing those versions or portraits throws each one and its unique nature into relief. When we harmonize or create one single portrait, we often obscure features of a person, and we also lose the creativity and interpretation of each individual artist. So multiple Jesuses is not a bad thing, and there are, in fact, multiple Jesuses. It's sort of an inescapable fact. There's the historical Jesus who lived and walked in first century Palestine. There's the perspective and presentation of Jesus that emphasizes his earthly life and his humanity. And there's the perspective that emphasizes his exalted divinity. These are not mutually exclusive from one another. A given text can present both a human Jesus and an exalted Jesus at the same time. And in the New Testament, each author does just that. They present Jesus in their own unique way, offering us a series of robust portraits of who Jesus was and still is. Mark provides us one of those perspectives, and when it comes to narrative accounts of Jesus' life, ministry, death, and resurrection, it's the first one, the first portrait in narrative form. This brings us to number 3. Mark was almost assuredly the first gospel to be written. We call this idea Markan Priority. There are a few really good reasons to think that Mark wrote before Matthew and Luke, and also before John. Most New Testament scholars, probably somewhere around 95%, hold to Markan Priority for these reasons and others. First, Mark is missing a lot of material that's included in Matthew and Luke. If Mark wrote after these authors, then he decided to omit some pretty important stuff, including an account of Jesus' birth, his appearance to his disciples after the resurrection, and many important parables and teachings, including the Sermon on the Mount. Second, both Matthew and Luke dramatically improve Mark literarily. They look up this gospel and say this is not quite up to snuff. They make consistent changes to Mark throughout their gospels. This is because Mark is characterized by an oral style, most likely because the gospel is an oral dictated text. Matthew and Luke are creating something more literary or bookish. Normally, when it comes to media development, things move from being more oral to more literary. And this is precisely what we find when it comes to Matthew and Luke and how they change Mark's style. Another point in favor of Markan Priority, the idea that Mark was written first, is editorial fatigue. Editorial fatigue is when an author is using a source, changes something about that source, but fails to consistently incorporate that change as they produce more text. That is, they revert back to what they originally find in their source text. A good example of this comes from the Matthew-Mark overlap, an episode that does not occur in Luke, the killing of John the Baptist in Mark 6 and Matthew 14. Here, Mark very consistently calls Herod king. Matthew, however, when introducing Herod, is a bit more accurate historically speaking. This is often the case of literary text in comparison to oral ones. Matthew knows that Herod was not really a king, but a ruler of a subdivided land, a tetrarch, kind of like a Roman installed prince. And Matthew makes this change as he begins to reproduce Mark's account. At the beginning, we see the change from king to tetrarch. But later on, in Matthew 14:9, Matthew reverts back to calling Herod a king as Mark does. This implies that Matthew was using Mark, not the other way around. Editorial fatigue is also at play in the narrative logic of this passage. Mark indicates that Herod actually kind of liked John the Baptist. Herod fears John, knows him to be a righteous and holy man, and he even protected him. He also liked to listen to him. This is not the case in Matthew's account. Herod does not like John the Baptist, according to Matthew. He wants to put him to death. In both Mark and Matthew, Herodias then dances for Herod, pleasing him so that Herod grants whatever she requests. She asks, in both accounts, for John's head on a platter, because why not? In Mark, it makes sense then that Herod is grieved about this. He kind of likes John. But in Matthew, Herod is also grieved. But why should he be? He wanted to put John to death, and Herodias' request should give him an out in doing so. It seems that Matthew has changed Herod's feelings about John at the beginning of the text, but then copied over Mark's statement about Herod being grieved, not thinking about how this was narratively inconsistent with the earlier change that he made. Again, the point here is that Matthew makes a change to Mark, and Mark is written first. Finally, when it comes to the reuse of synoptic material, it's clear that the dependency is literary, not oral. As we'll see in just a little bit here, when we look at parallels, there's verbatim repetition of large swaths of material. This kind of verbatim repetition and exactitude on the scale that we see in the synoptics is not possible in the oral mode, even in a culture that was more dependent on orality for its central stories than ours is. Also, the overarching storyline is consistent across the Synoptic Gospels. This suggests that Mark is being used as a base text, and the order of events as they are written in Mark are followed by the other two Synoptic Gospels. Finally, the beginning of the Gospel of Luke suggests that the author knew and used other written sources, implying that they were using a literary source, not an oral source that they had heard. Number 2, there are two main solutions to the synoptic problem: the two-source theory and the Farrer theory. The beginning of Luke may suggest that the author of that gospel used other sources, but it doesn't indicate how many sources were used or what sources they were. It's pretty clear that both Luke and Matthew used Mark. This is the idea of Markan Priority, and it explains the triple tradition. But Markan Priority cannot explain where the double tradition material comes from. We return to that question and two theories that offer competing answers for the shared material between Matthew and Luke that they do not get from the Gospel of Mark. The first theory, and the one that is most popular amongst New Testament scholars in the 20th century, is called the two-source theory. As its name implies, it posits that there are two foundational sources that are at play when solving the synoptic problem. The first is the Gospel of Mark. The two-source theory holds to Markan priority. It acknowledges that both Matthew and Luke used Mark. The arrows here indicate that material from Mark is going into Matthew and into Luke. Here, represented is the triple tradition, as well as the Matthew-Mark overlap and the Luke-Mark overlap. But notice that there's no line connecting Matthew and Luke here. To explain the shared material between Matthew and Luke, the double tradition material, the two-source hypothesis posits a second source, and it is very cleverly called source in German, Quelle, or Q for short. The arrows here indicate that material from Q goes into both Matthew and into Luke. But there is no line between Matthew and Luke because Matthew and Luke do not know each other. All of their shared material is counted for from Mark or from this other source Q under the two-source theory. The competing solution to the two-source theory is called the Farrer theory, named after one of its main proponents, Austin Farrer. This theory also holds to Markan priority, but it dispenses with Q. Under the Farrer theory, Matthew uses Mark, and Luke uses both Mark and Matthew. Notice that there are lines connecting all three Gospels. Mark goes into Matthew and into Luke, and Matthew goes into Luke. The Farrer theory thus explains the triple tradition, the Matthew-Mark overlap, the Luke-Mark overlap, and the double tradition. Both of these theories have their merit and evidence in support of them. When it comes to the two-source theory, the logic of unlikely omissions that supported Markan priority can also support the two-source theory. If Luke was using Matthew, or if Matthew was using Luke, some of the material that each one or the other one has omitted is a bit curious. For example, if Luke was using Matthew, the fact that he left out the parable of the sheep and the goats, which demonstrates a concern for the poor and oppressed, would make a lot of sense for Luke to include, as a concern for the poor and oppressed is a major thematic concern of Luke's gospel. But we don't find that parable in Luke. It's just in Matthew. A similar logic is at work with unshared additions. These are places that Matthew or Luke add something that they find in Mark, but the other gospel, Matthew or Luke, does not include it. So if Luke is reading both Matthew and Mark, and he comes across a more expanded account in Matthew, why would he opt to follow Mark's shortened version and not opt to follow Matthew's longer version? Finally, and probably most significantly for two-source theorists, is there's a whole lot of consistency in the double tradition material that doesn't necessarily look like material that's unique to Matthew. So the stuff of the double tradition is consistent with itself, but it's different from Matthew. So the logic is that the Q source was a document that functioned on its own with its own particular themes and ideas, just like Mark did. We might then speak of Q's Jesus when it comes to our multiple Jesuses. But there's also compelling evidence for the Farrer theory. Probably the most significant is the fact that there is no piece of material evidence, no scrap of material evidence for Q, and no ancient authors at all mention it. It's a hypothetical document that's been created by scholars to solve a problem, a deus ex machina. Second, there are places in the triple tradition, those passages shared between Mark, Matthew, and Luke, where Luke and Matthew agree with one another in minor ways that are different from Mark. These are called, very fittingly, the minor agreements. In these places, the Farrer theory can simply say that Luke has followed Matthew instead of Mark. Two-source theorists, holding that Luke does not look at Matthew, must conclude that Matthew and Luke independently decided to make the same changes as one another. For Farrer theorists, this seems too coincidental, and this works for Farrer theorists because the Q document in the two-source theory is not thought to explain material from the triple tradition, but normally only explains material in the double tradition. And so I want to show you an example of a so-called minor agreement. In the parable of the mustard seed, which is found in the triple tradition, so not thought to be a Q version of this parable, Q normally only explains the double tradition, Mark states that a mustard seed will grow up and put forth large branches so that the birds of the air can make nests in its shade. Both Matthew and Luke state, slightly differently from Mark, that the mustard seed becomes a tree. It doesn't put forth large branches, it becomes a tree, and that the bird make nests not in its shade, as in Mark, but in its branches. Farrer theorists think it's very unlikely that Matthew and Luke would have made this exact same change. For them, it's far more likely that Luke simply likes Matthew's changes, and so he keeps them. There are a handful of reasons that adherents to the Farrer theory think that Matthew is used by Luke rather than the other way around. That is, Luke being used by Matthew. First, Luke says at the beginning of the gospel that he used other sources. Matthew doesn't say this, though it's clear he does use at least one, namely Mark. Second, some of Jesus' best work, at least when it comes to parables, are only in Luke. It would not make a lot of sense to take the parable of the Good Samaritan or the parable of the prodigal son out of a new gospel. It'd be like taking Hey Jude or Let It Be off of a Beatles' greatest hits album. Finally, there are places it appears that Luke editorially fatigues on Matthew. He institutes a change from something in Matthew at the beginning, but doesn't follow through with that change. And we don't really find instances of the reverse, where Matthew appears to be fatiguing on Luke. Here's one quick example where it appears that Luke is fatiguing on Matthew, the parable of the wicked slaves. In Matthew, the man who's the master goes on a journey and leaves 3 slaves with different number of talents. Luke decides to change this. Rather than having 3 slaves, there are 10 slaves in the Gospel of Luke, and they get £1 each. Both Matthew and Luke then explain how the master comes back and the slaves come to him reporting what they have earned. In Matthew, each of the 3 slaves come back, which makes pretty good sense. But when it comes to Luke, only 3 of the 10 slaves come back, and Luke does not indicate that there are any more than 3 slaves. He says the first came forward, the second came forward, and then the other came forward. Not the others in the plural, not the 8 others, but the other one. So it seems Luke has changed the 3 to 10, but then in the explanation of what happens when the master comes back, he doesn't incorporate that change that he made from the beginning of Matthew's parable. The short of it is that there are 2 main competing solutions to the synoptic problem. The 2-source theory holds that 2 sources are the key to solving that problem. The Farrer theory holds that Luke's use of Matthew is the key to solving that problem. As I mentioned, for a long time, for most of the 20th century, the 2-source theory was the one favored amongst most New Testament scholars. However, recently the Farrer theory has gained substantial ground, and I'd estimate that we're approaching a relatively even split amongst scholars who hold to the Farrer and the 2-source theories respectively. And number 1, color coding is a productive method for reading and interpreting the Synoptic Gospels alongside one another. This is where we're going to get a little bit hands-on. If you have a Gospel Parallels book and some colored pencils, it might be helpful for you to work through this with me. I'm going to give 2 examples of color coding, but before I do, I want to mention that the act of studying a text with an eye to how an author or authors change their source text and what differences those changes make is called redaction criticism. Redaction criticism helps us to see the differences between texts, in this case the Synoptic Gospels, and ask questions about why those differences might matter. Things like, how do these changes reflect larger themes in each respective gospel? And why might an author make that change to align with that particular theme? Redaction criticism also looks at how different synoptic solutions would explain the similarities and differences that arise that we notice in the act of comparison. By color coding these texts, we are participating in redaction criticism. We're going to start with the primary colors, red, yellow, and blue, one for each of the Synoptic Gospels. This is convenient because the combination of the primary colors make other colors. So the combination of all 3 Synoptic Gospels is going to be brown. The combination of Mark and Luke is going to be orange. The combination of Matthew and Mark, purple, and the combination of Matthew and Luke, green. In my opinion, it's best to start with the center term, Mark, and compare to the left and then to the right. You might want to pause here and see what's shared between all 3 Gospels. You can mark your text if you want to, or you can wait until I mark it and copy my marking. And that's usually where I start, again, with the brown. And so this is what it's going to look like when I color it. Mark, Matthew, and Luke all have John the Baptist's basic proclamation about Jesus. It all gets underlined or highlighted in brown. Next, I tend to move what's shared between Matthew and Mark, but what is not in Luke. this is what's in purple. And for me, it's going to look like this. It's just the two words after me. Moving on to the overlap between Mark and Luke, the orange, I have this small bit. Mark and Luke share the bit about untying the thong of Jesus' sandals. This leaves us only a little bit of material that's unique to Mark in red. Mark has John proclaiming the statement, but Matthew and Luke have it embedded in a larger conversation. I've also marked have baptized as red, even though Matthew and Luke also have the verb baptize, which I have put here in green. And I put it in green because the tense of the verb, we're missing that have, so it is not what is called a perfect tense verb. It is a present tense verb in Matthew and in Luke. You might imagine here a far theorist claiming that the change of the tense of the verb is a bit too coincidental to have happened independently without Luke looking at Matthew. And then this whole saying is also added in green. For far theorists, this is simply a matter of Luke following Matthew by including the statement. Two-source theorists have to do a little bit more explaining. As I've said, under most circumstances, Q only explains material in double tradition passages, not triple tradition passages like this one. Let me say that again. Normally, Q only explains material in double tradition passages, not triple tradition passages. In this case, however, two-source theorists make an exception. They say that this is a place where there's overlap between Mark and Q, and Matthew and Luke are looking at both of them. So this leaves us with for repentance and carry as unique to Matthew. One might ask then if Matthew tends to emphasize repentance more than the other synoptics do. Is this a unique Matthean bit, a result of a unique Matthean theme? And then the yellow is what is unique to Luke, only the framing of the entire saying. But the framing of the saying is pretty positive, which is going to be relevant to the context that follows. So it's often good to think about our comparisons not only in the context of the single passage, but of the literary context at large. Here in yellow, we see that the people are expectant about John and the Messiah, and Luke even says that John proclaims the good news or the gospel to them. Let's now look at a double tradition passage, something that only occurs in Matthew and Luke, and under the two-source theory would be explained by Q, and under the far theory would be explained by Luke using Matthew. This one's a bit easier to mark because we only have 2 points of comparison rather than 3. Most of John the Baptist's proclamation is contained in both. This is the green. What's different is that in Matthew, it's the Pharisees and the Sadducees that are coming out to Jesus, whereas in Luke, it's the crowds from the previous context that we were just looking at. This makes John's statement about the crowds to whom he proclaimed the gospel being a brood of vipers a bit strange. It makes a bit better sense in Matthew because Matthew doesn't like the Pharisees and the Sadducees, but Luke does tend to like the crowds. Perhaps we have some editorial fatigue happening. The other differences here are going to be a bit minor, but we should highlight them anyway. Matthew has a singular fruit, whereas Luke's is plural, and there's a difference in the verb presume and begin. Students often ask how detailed they ought to be when they mark the Synoptic Gospels in parallel this way. My response is always to be as detailed as it is helpful. This color coding is a method that's meant to reveal similarities and differences. It's a tool. And sometimes small similarities and differences actually can reveal quite a lot. So there's a value in being detailed, but other times they don't. And this is the fun of it all. Color coding these passages helps us to observe and gather data about the synoptics. It's then with that data that we can make hypotheses about the Synoptic Gospels, what their themes are, what each individual author is trying to do, and the reasons for the similarities and differences between the Synoptic Gospels.